Next evolution video, my friends. This is chapter 17, and we are calling this the history of life. In this video, we really start to talk about the fossil record more in depth, and we can talk about how do we look at fossils, how do we use them to compare extinct species to species that are alive today, and how we date fossils, how we figure out, I don't mean how do we take fossils out to the prom, I mean how do we figure out how old fossils are, and then how do we use those to sort of to get a picture of how life has changed over time. So let's start first with a more in-depth definition of what the fossil record is. Fossil record provides evidence about the history of life on Earth. It includes so much information. So if you're looking for fossil evidence about a reptile, you can look at fossil evidence of very early reptiles, think pre-dinosaur. You can look at fossil evidence of reptiles that have lived just over the last 100,000 years. And so we can look at how the group of animals, reptiles, has changed over time. We can look at how have organisms with a spinal cord changed over time. So we can look at really early fossils up and look at living things today. Or we can just look at very specific species, like maybe a specific species of dinosaur in comparison to a species that we see today. It can show us how individuals or groups have changed over time. This last piece of data on the slide here says that 99% of all species that have ever lived on Earth have gone extinct. For some scientists, that number is a little lower. For some, it's even higher. Some say it's 99.9. But what that statement is trying to say is that most adaptations don't work. Most adaptations that happen either don't work long-term or they don't work at all. Most mutations that pop up are not beneficial. They're completely random. And if you're lucky enough, you win that genetic lottery where you are either passed down an adaptation that helps or you develop a mutation that's helpful. And that's incredibly rare, which is why so many species have gone extinct over time. If an organism or a species is adapted to its environment, that's fantastic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to be adapted to the environment that they're in, because the environment changes all the time. That's one of the big reasons why organisms continuously go extinct, because we have changes in the environment. We have huge, massive changes in population, like genetic drift, which we talked about in video 1. We have asteroids hitting the planet causing massive climate shifts. We have climate change. We have ice ages. We have diseases that are coming through and wiping out organisms. So it's incredibly rare that an organism in the history of our planet lives or survives for very long when looking at the big picture. So most are extinct because most adaptations just don't help long term. Now let's talk about how we look at some of those that have gone extinct and compare them to living things. The first concept is called relative dating. And I'm sure you heard my horrible joke in class before this. This is not where you take your relative to the prom, or take your relative out to dinner. This is where you're looking at fossils or layers of rock in relation to the ones around it. So you can think of this in a few different ways. One way is just to think that if you're looking at layers of sedimentary rock and you know that the bottom layer is the oldest, you can look at those layers of rock in relation to each other and know that the next layer above it is just a little bit younger, and the next layer is just a little bit younger, until we're working our way all the way up to the surface where you would see living organisms. So we're looking at fossils and what we see around them in relation to each other. Now, unfortunately, fossils don't always work that way. Remember, the Earth is always changing and shifting, so you can have earthquakes and shifts in tectonic plates that can shift where rock is currently from where it originally laid. So if you may have had some lovely sedimentary rock that was all straight like this, and you had some great fossils in there, and you could look at this fantastic timeline, but maybe those rocks have shifted over time. So relative dating is, it can be very beneficial for just sort of a starting point with evolution. But if we want to get a little more specific and a little more exact about how old a fossil is, we use radioactive dating. Okay. What radioactive dating does is it uses different isotopes that we know are present in living things. One of them is called carbon-14. That's one of the most common ones that's used. And it uses the predictable decay of those isotopes to determine how old an organism is. So all organisms have carbon-14 in them. It's an isotope of carbon where you've got 14 particles in the nucleus. Every living thing on the planet has it in them. And it has a half-life of about 5,700 years. So that means that once an organism dies, it doesn't take in any more carbon-14 because you only take that stuff in when you're going through cellular respiration, taking in food, breathing in that oxygen. Once you're not taking that in anymore, your carbon-14 stops. So as soon as you die, or as soon as an organism dies, it's not going to take in any carbon-14, but it is going to start to lose it at a predictable rate. So if we can look at an organism and see that it had 100% of its carbon-14 when it died. After 5,700 years, it's going to have half of that. After another 5,700 years, it's going to have a quarter of that. And we can do that all the way up to about 50,000 years. So fossils and remains that we find now, anywhere between about 5,700, anywhere between about 5,000 years old and 50,000 years old, we can look at their carbon-14 to see about how old it is. And that's pretty good. That's pretty accurate to be able to guess that between, 5,000, 10,000 years. For things that are older than 50,000 years, so think your dinosaur fossils, we have to use isotopes that have a longer half-life. So there's an isotope of uranium that has a half-life of like 1.5 million years. So if we look at a dinosaur fossil and we see that it has half the uranium it's supposed to have, we would know that it's 1.5 million years old. Although most dinosaur fossils are far older than that. Those are great, but not very accurate. If I've got a half-life of 1.5 million years, my next half-life doesn't happen for another 1.5 million. I have a little bit of a space in there where I can't really get too accurate. But radioactive dating continuously gets more and more accurate as we move along. We have sort of combinations of relative and radioactive dating looking at uranium and carbon-14. So scientists can predict the age of a fossil pretty accurately. There's usually give and take of a few thousand years, sometimes a few tens of thousands of years, maybe sometimes even up to 1 million years as those fossils get older. But in terms of evolution, that's not actually a lot of time because evolution takes a long time. Okay, now moving forward, we're talking about a concept called convergent evolution. When you converge, it means two living things sort of coming together, or just two of anything coming together. Convergent evolution is the idea that you have different organisms, and some of them may be extinct, some of them might be living today. And because they live or lived in similar environments, they develop similar traits, even if the instructions for those traits are different. So think of it like a synonym, okay? The two things can mean the same. So in these organisms right here, they all have a dorsal fin because they all have to swim really, really fast to catch their prey and sometimes to escape predators. The ichthyosaur, okay, a giant reptile, completely extinct. And then we have a shark and then a dolphin. So they all have these dorsal fins. They all have these really thin front flippers to help them turn quickly in the water because all three of them, they're living in the open ocean. They have to catch prey that is super fast usually. And so they all developed similar traits, but the directions for them are different. So think of it like an evolutionary synonym, sort of. Means the same thing, but they got there in a different way. There's a video on here, if you guys get a second to watch it, about convergent evolution of hyenas and dogs. They both have bone-crushing mechanisms in their jaws, but hyenas are actually really closely related to cats, not dogs. All right, last one, and we're still talking about fossil record. This is where we're going to use fossil record and evidence of extinct animals to look at their relationship with their surroundings and also compare it to living species. So coevolution. Think when you have a coworker, it's someone that works with you, and these would be organisms that evolve together. They evolve in response to one another. So here we've got a Brachiosaurus. And then we have this really, really, really tall conifer tree. Now, the Brachiosaurus didn't get a long neck because the tree is tall. Okay, it didn't like stretch its neck up and get a longer neck because the tree is tall. That's thinking like Lamarck, and remember, we don't want to think like Lamarck. Okay, what happened was the Brachiosaurus, as its neck got longer, okay, it probably ate from taller trees and then spread the seeds of those taller trees. Okay. As the trees got taller, the Brachiosaurus who had the longer neck is going to be the one who can survive, and it's going to be the one that's going to be able to eat that tree. So as one got bigger, the other one had to get bigger because they're dependent on each other. Okay. And that's it for chapter 17, guys. You've got coevolution. As one gets taller, the other one has to get